I am going to show you just one project today, and first of all I'd like to thank Teresa and the organisers for inviting me, Adrian, and everybody. It's been an amazing 4 days or 5 days, but it's been great. And so I'm just going to talk about one project, so I don't have so much time. And it's a recent ongoing project that has been in process now for about 3 years, and it comes out of my interest in Utopia. And I teach. Teaching is part of my. Can you turn that light off? Teaching is part of my practice. It's not a separate thing. It's not something I do on the side. It's actually an integrated part of my praxis, if you like, and that includes research, research teaching, things like this, and projects involving, sometimes they involve collaborations. A lot of times they will involve collaborations. Sometimes I work alone, and I work in the public realm, primarily in terms of building. I work quite closely with engineers, landscape architects, working on larger infrastructural projects for cities and towns. And I'm interested in play as well, so I'm starting to design playgrounds and play elements for city spaces. So my interest in Utopia, I actually lead a Utopia seminar in Copenhagen where I teach at the Royal Academy there. I run a department there on public space and public art. And one of the things I do is I teach a Utopia seminar. And my interest in Utopia comes out of Utopia as a process, as a journey, which most utopias are, as a place to somewhere. Rather than actually arriving somewhere, it's that journey to somewhere. And for me, that movement, that process, that journey is a kind of critical journey. It's about revealing what is maybe different or wrong with conditions on the ground. And so for me, Utopia is not finding a sort of ideal state or a finished thing or an ideal society. It's about the process that you can take together, critiquing the situation that you're in, and sort of continually changing that situation. So here we have Cranach's Garden of Earthly Delights. You see, I think it is a garden, and in fact, pretty much all utopias were gardens, were agricultural or are agricultural, and they are usually city-based. There's very, very few pastoral type or utopias that you'd find in the countryside. They usually have this kind of urban dimension to them. Lewis Montfort talks about how the city is actually a paradigm for utopia. But this wall is interesting because paradise is a very ancient word for a sticky wall, a paradisa, which is basically the wall that was around the royal enclosure where they would keep animals and they'd have a park. And that's where the term paradise actually kind of evolves from. And Utopia is interesting because it's very specific. It's not necessarily a religious, it's a kind of a secular paradise. It's not shouldn't be confused with a religious idea of paradise. Also, it shouldn't be confused with science fiction. So here we go, there's the classic. We saw that, Ian showed that, not this particular image, but we saw that view before of Alcatraz. And so you have, again, the first idea of utopia written down, again used as a critical tool, was Thomas More's Utopia. And it really was a critique of the society in which he lived. Moving slightly forward and a little bit backwards, this is a great book about the millenarian groups that evolved from the mid-1600s and also a little bit before, and how that once the Bible was more widely distributed and was easier to read, was accessible basically, groups of people got together and started to develop their own types of societies from their readings of the Bible. And those forms, which are related in this book, took on quite amazing forms. There were thousands of them. In England, during the Civil War, for example, there were literally thousands of these groups, all trying to define their own way of life, from very early forms of communism. There were some were based on kind of feminist ideals, feminist principles. There were, of course, people who believed that you should just live without clothes on. There were vegetarians. It's a very interesting, rich period with kind of utopian thinking. And of course, the most famous of these groups were the Diggers, and Gerald Whitstanley was their spokesperson. And they basically were kind of a very early Occupy movement to a certain degree. They basically tried to retake common land and by farming it, by occupying it. And they were evicted eventually, but violently evicted. But they have also become a kind of paradigm for later groups who actually, some of them actually called the Diggers, for example, in the 70s in San Francisco, the Diggers literally take their ideas from this group, but slightly less sort of politicized in a way, or slightly different, of course. Nevertheless, they were inspired by these groups. This is one of the first utopian novels written by a woman, written by Charlotte Perkins Gilman. And interestingly, it's not the problem is with utopian novels, they're actually very difficult to read because they're mainly quite boring. They're sort of quite dull in a way. But this is an interesting book in that it actually describes a paradise, a forest gardening paradise, a kind of permaculture paradise. And permaculture is a term that comes out of the 70s. And it's an idea of using local means to solve local problems. And it's based on a form of forest gardening, basically, of orchard-based forest gardening, using fruit trees and various. Basically, the tree is central to the gardening process, to the gardening technique or the process of the thought. And the ideas of permaculture then expand upon social structures, energy production. It covers a lot of things. It's a very, I have my own critical thoughts of it. There are parts of it which I don't agree with, but there are things of it in it that are very useful in terms of looking at how maybe society might work. And a more sort of genteel version that comes out of the permaculture movement is the transition town movement. That's very much based on permaculture principles. But this book actually describes those principles to a certain degree very early on. It's the Victorian period, late Victorian period. And women have been hidden away in this, on this cliff, on this plateau for millennia, and they've learned how to have children without men, which is called, I think it's called parthenogenesis. And men arrive, they crash in the airplane, they arrive, they start to mess things up, and they're very quickly ejected from paradise. But it's a very interesting novel. The clothes are describing, they have very good clothes that they wear, especially for farming in orchards. So it's a very early form of permaculture gardening. Utopia is also a very kind of classic utopian novel, probably one of the last utopian novels to come out of that as a sort of utopia, as a genre, if you like, as a fiction. And it was funded, interestingly, by Stuart Brand, who was the author of the Whole Earth Catalogue, one of the founders of the Whole Earth Catalogue, which was so successful that they made enough money to develop a whole publishing company. They set up a very early form of venture capitalism. This is like early 70s, late 60s, more late 60s. And they basically, after they'd done the Whole Earth Catalogue, they got together with the money that they made and decided to send out friends around the world to look for interesting ecological projects, which they would then fund. And this novel by Ernst Kallenbach is one of those projects that they funded from the Whole Earth Catalogue. And it describes a state very similar to Portland. I don't know if you've ever been to Portland, Oregon, but it's actually very similar to that. So, permaculture. My interest in permaculture, where I teach in Copenhagen, I've actually tried to develop a permaculture course that runs parallel to the art course, so the students together with a permaculture designer get the permaculture degree with their art degree, and that has worked, so been successful to a certain degree. It's not completely successful. But there are things about this that I don't like. I don't like this sort of symbolism. There are things I find I'm quite critical of. But in some respects, it's a very interesting and kind of all-embracing gardening method that comes out of a utopian tradition. Now, I was, in 2008, just before the market crashed, I was invited by Stroom in The Hague, which is a public art commissioning institution. It's an arts institution that basically comes out of a tradition of looking after public sculptures in the city of The Hague. And they now develop much long-term projects, more ephemeral type things, and more kind of public realm type activities, not just bronze sculptures. And one of the things they wanted to do was to look at this new part of The Hague, which they were, or an old part of The Hague, they were redeveloping as a creative industries hub. And this is quite interesting in relationship to maybe what Sally was talking about, and also with Andrea with Folkestone. They were actually looking at the way that culture could possibly kind of re-jolt the what was going on in The Hague, the kind of decline, if you like, the industrial decline of The Hague, and try and reboot it with culture. And this was the proposal by OMA. And I don't know if any of you have been to The Hague, but this is like probably like hell in a Dutch landscape. It's like completely, you've got MoMA The Hague, you have like 4 or 5 large gherkins of different shapes and sizes. You have for the Frank Gehry type building, there's a harbour, there's a Formula 1 racetrack, there's a beach. I kind of get the feeling from looking through their master plan that it's kind of maybe they are being quite ironic, but it's strange that this is actually what they're proposing for the city, so it's kind of highly cynical in a way. And of course this was just before 2008, and that all was just cancelled. And, but the project continued. The project, the art part of it, this is Stroom have invested in these very long-term durational art projects. And so my response to that, what we just saw, this kind of master plan, this top-down master plan for the city was like, I was kind of reacting against that, like how would you develop something in opposition to that? What could be different from this? And so my ideas looking at permaculture came out of a way of like, how do you develop maybe using permaculture as a solution to city building and city design. So very, very luckily, there's a permaculture group in the city who were just starting up, and they were very, very, very enthusiastic. They were very, very ready to go. Basically, they had a garden already, which was great, a really amazing garden based on permaculture principles. And I started to collaborate with them very closely, and I basically gave them my budget, the budget that was given to me as an artist. I just said, okay, let's take this budget and let's develop permaculture sites in the city, which to see them as sort of paradigms for basically looking at The Hague in a larger context of how to actually change The Hague using permaculture principles. And so very luckily we were given 2 sites in The Hague. One is in a municipal park, like a very European, very very normal park that we're all very familiar with, and the other was on the edge of a large allotment garden, kind of an unused meadow, a fallow meadow. And astonishingly, we were given these spaces. In a way, we were actually given too much space because it became very difficult to actually manage 2 large sites. And each site one site is probably about 8 acres, and the other site is a bit larger. And so we started to use permaculture principles to develop these 2 test sites, if you like. These are just some of the references from which we were kind of gleaning from, looking at old 70s communes, looking at this building, quite famous building, which was built on it still exists. It's by a guy called Tony Wrench. It's a roundhouse. It's actually built very similar to the nest that was described on Thursday, where the roof is actually self-supporting by these kind of interlocking timbers. And and also things like Drop City, trying to look at these different self-build ideas to utilize them to develop something for these sites. And also the edible schoolyard in Oakland, which I think was mentioned yesterday, but maybe it was mentioned in the pub. It's in Berkeley. Yeah. And this is actually has become a quite famous garden where this used to be all like a big tarmac playground, and it's been redeveloped into an edible garden, if you like, a schoolyard where all this is used. This is basically education. This is part of the children of a high school, their education. It's like their classroom where they learn how to grow food, produce food, and cook it as well, which in a city is actually quite unusual. It's very unusual. Also looking back to someone, this is a very interesting guy called Lebrecht Miga, who worked very closely with Bruno Taut just before the war. And what they were doing was informed by anarchist ideas of social housing, gardening, and so on. And he developed, together with Bruno Taut, some of the first social housing, large modernist social housing projects in Germany. And a very famous one is the Horseshoe in Berlin, which some of you may have visited even. But he actually had some interesting ideas about gardening, and here you can see a bit like what we saw yesterday, a kind of breakdown of how much you need, how much space you need, how many chickens you need, how many goats and so on you need to survive in terms of population. So he tried to break this down statistically, and then looking at plots of land to figure out how much space was needed. And then also people would have composting toilets. They would basically work. He was looking at how social housing, from a modernist kind of large-scale perspective, would work if everybody actually produced their own food and recycled their own waste and so on. And this again is very early. You know, it's quite progressive and again informed by anarchist principles. Bruno Taut himself was an interesting character. He was a kind of utopian visionary in a way. He basically spent a lot of his free time drawing these very beautiful these watercolors of these mountain alpine landscapes using crystalline forms. And some people see these as kind of the inspiration of like the Manhattan skyline, for example, skyscrapers and so on. And together, Taut, and this is actually one of Taut's most famous buildings, is this pavilion that he built in Cologne for a World's Fair there. And it's quite an iconic modernist building. And here you see the Horseshoe Estate, and also different ideas that Taut and Miga worked on together before the war. So these were the kind of inspirations, these were the sort of references we were looking at together. And this is one of the sites we were given. It's actually in Dutch parks. They have a kind of educational site where there's a lot of gardening that goes on. It's all monocultural. And so we were given part of this site. And through the development of the project, it became, just by chance, it wasn't really something that was planned. Each stage of the project became an educational work. It became a workshop. It became layer after layer of workshop. So each stage had a kind of educational dimension to it. So it wasn't us just sitting in our in studio drawing drawings. It was actually every stage of the idea was workshopped together with people interested in permaculture, in gardening, in alternative energy systems, and so on. So this is actually designs for the garden and the pavilion by permaculture students. These are models by the students. And these are just different ideas that were thrown around at the beginning. And then to a point where I actually found something that we all agreed upon and started building it. And what became very clear very quickly was visually, it's actually a very good learning educational tool, because visually this type of garden is very, very different from the park in which it's in. And that difference creates a tool which is actually very, very powerful visually, because it actually shows you that a space is different. And that brings people to it. It actually it opens the space up, if you like. So one of the things we started building very quickly was a shelter for workshops, for activities to keep warm, for school groups and so on. And that was, because it was an art project, because it was sort of, this is also an interesting part for me, is that sometimes it's an art project, sometimes it was a kind of gardening project, sometimes it was an ecology project. It shifted out of these different identities, which was very useful in terms of funding and getting around certain regulations. And so sometimes I'm the author, sometimes the permaculture gardens are the author, sometimes the kids gardening, they become the kind of authors of the project. So it's all shifting in terms of what it is. And I like that a lot, about how that works. And so even the building of this pavilion becomes, again, a series of workshops. And this is all based on, so we're building a straw bale pavilion with a turf, with a sod roof. And this is a cob that's been the cob is being put on the straw bale. And there hasn't, a building like this has not been built in Holland before. It's considered illegal. So because then we took out our art sort of, because we used this sort of art project idea, we got round a lot of planning problems, and we were allowed to build it because it's considered an art project. One of the things that we were very wary of is actually trying to avoid this kind of tribal hut. And what we did was to do that, we tried to, again, create a more modernist type feeling to it, also using recycled city urban materials from the city, and using this reference to Bruno Taut and modernist architecture. Again, the garden, these are the very interesting permaculture kind of elements within the garden. This is actually a bank of just woody waste that's just left to sit there, and that becomes a huge swathe that goes through the site to increase biodiversity in the site. And there's also a rocket stove inside that actually warms, it's actually fed into a seating system that goes round the building to warm up the inside. And it's still there, it's still going. It's a very long-term project. I still go there. I'm not actually, the project finished last year in terms of the overall project from Strom, and now it's just continuing on its own. And I go there as a kind of trustee, if you like. I go there probably maybe every second month to see the guys and see how it's going and so on. So that's it.